Okay. Okay. Hi, Founders fans. Going live. Going live. I've learned that this part is recorded, so if you're watching this, it means you're watching in the past. And it's going live. I'm live now. It says I'm live there. Hi, Founder fans. I've been live for 15 seconds. Hooray. Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to my weekly Week in Review, where we will be discussing the articles that I wrote for founderoftheday.com in the last 7 days. As always, the last 5 days were brand new, and Saturdays and Sundays I write articles. I publish articles that I had written in the past that I like, and would, since it's been a year and a half or so, hopefully give them a little more attention again. Great, people coming in, 3 of you already, welcome. If you want to leave a comment, say have anything, questions that you'd like answered now or along the way, always welcome. As people stroll in, I hope things are going well. Hopefully, excuse me, we're all enjoying our time at home. I know I certainly am. Excuse me. I will say, you might notice, I've added to my set. I made a video on my Patreon page, which if you'd like to contribute, I would really appreciate, and you can see more about it there. But this was a desk my mom had given me a long time ago, a bookshelf, more accurately, that was down in our dining room. What I had here was one of those pushcart bars that I had cut the arms off, and we were using it to store some files, and I found a spot for it in my kitchen, and it's nice because I feel like the wood looks a lot better than whatever it was. It was wood and glass, but not the point. And that's not what you're here for. You are here to talk about the American Revolution. So let's get into it without further ado. So, last week, the first article I wrote was a, where did it go? Okay. The first article I published was an old article I had written about the founding of the Bank of New York. The star of the show was Alexander Hamilton, who is someone you probably know. Not the obscure or at least lesser known founders I usually write about, but I thought the story about the founding of the Bank of New York was extremely interesting. I should note, I apologize for the cars driving by. I can't seem to mute these windows any better. I have an old house with very thin windows, and I apologize for that. But, so, the Bank of New York. Basically, after the Articles of Confederation were ratified, money was tight, and New York was hurting because it had a shipping industry in particular was hurting because there was no bank, and the Articles of Confederation didn't provide one. Now, they had created the Bank of North America in Philadelphia, and I believe Massachusetts had created the Bank of Massachusetts, but the Bank of New York became one of the most important banks in the early United States. And its founding was extremely interesting because everyone realized there was no bank, and we had just won this war, and there was an opening for someone to come in, because creating a bank would not only help the country and at least help the state of New York, but if you own a bank, you're going to make a lot of money. So there were two people who, Jeremiah Wadsworth and John Barker Church, who they helped supply the Continental Army during the war, and they had both gone to Europe to collect the money that was owed to them that they had made during supplying the war from the French and other nations that they had, been acting with to create the supplies. Now, while they were abroad, John Barker Church, who actually was a brother-in-law of Alexander Hamilton, they had both married Schuyler sisters. If you are familiar with that Broadway play Hamilton, the Schuyler sisters are a big part of that. And Angelica Schuyler, who Hamilton's secondary love interest, if you want to call her that, her actual husband was a man named John Barker Church, whose story is in itself fascinating. He had come to the United States under an assumed name, and blah, blah, blah. I may have made an early video on him, but I should put out another video on him later this week. Or soon. Okay, now I've said it. I'll do it this week. Anyway, they were in Europe, but they wanted to start a bank in New York, so they contacted Alexander Hamilton and said, hey, can you set up this bank for us? And Hamilton said, sure. But he quickly realized that they were not the first ones to have this idea. Another bank was also being set up, which was being led by George Clinton, who was a longtime governor of New York. And, well, Hamilton quickly realized it would be fairly difficult to beat the governor of New York when it came to creating a bank. So what he actually did is he talked with Clinton and some of the other people who were working with Clinton and said, why don't we work together? And he basically played middleman, which is the title of the article I wrote. Hamilton plays middleman. And the idea was, hey, why don't we come together and make one bank and we'll all share the profits? It's going to be a lot of money we make, so we might as well, we're not going to hurt for too much because of that. And Hamilton, when he wrote, he made this decision and started acting on it. But again, word traveled slowly across the ocean by boat. So Hamilton wrote back to Wadsworth and Church and said, I quote, he concluded it best to fall in with them, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because you weren't going to beat him. What's interesting, so Alexander McDougall, who was a general in the Revolutionary War, became the first president, but there were 13 original board members, which included Hamilton, Nicholas Lowe, who I made a video about a while back. Between him and his brother Isaac, they had parted ways during the Revolution. William Maxwell, and a man named Isaac Roosevelt. Now, if this is the best segue of my life, because if the name Roosevelt sounds familiar to you, well, it's because Franklin Delano FDR Roosevelt, I can't get it out, FDR Roosevelt, his great-great-grandfather was a man named Isaac Roosevelt. And Isaac Roosevelt was who I published my article about last Sunday. How convenient. So Isaac Roosevelt was, the Roosevelts, you might remember from other history studies, came from old money. And a lot of that old money, at least in the FDR chain of the Roosevelt family, came from Isaac Roosevelt. And how did he make this money, you might ask? Well, he, first of all, invested in sugar. He actually had the first sugar refinery in New York City. It wasn't the first in the United States, but it was in New York City, as New York City was becoming New York City. And he made a fortune selling this, I don't want to say sweet treats, but the product that makes sweet treats and does various other things. I mean, sugar's used in all fashions of baking. I'm not a culinary master. I've been getting better over the last year or two, ever since I got some cast iron and fell in love with that. But I understand sugar can be used in certain breads and this and that. So, as you know, sugar is sugar, and selling it and being the #1 seller in New York City, then as now, I would imagine, was a very lucrative business. And because of that, he would end up investing elsewhere, and including the Bank of New York. Which, by the way, when I say the Bank of New York, founded in 1774, if you hear of Bank of New York Mellon today, that's the same company. That's a private bank, first of all. It's a private bank. It is not New York's bank. And it is still around 200 blah, blah, blah years later. And again, they did, I think it was in like 2007, came together with Carnegie Mellon and became New York Mellon, but still, it comes from the same place. And Isaac Roosevelt, that was one of the many places he invested. What's really interesting about the Roosevelt family is, we know we have Franklin Roosevelt, and I don't want to get too far from the American Revolution here, but we have Franklin Roosevelt, we have Teddy Roosevelt, and they came from two chains, the Long Island Roosevelts and the New Hyde Park Roosevelts in just upstate New York, not too far from New York City, in the Hudson River Valley. And it was Isaac's father and his uncle. They were both born to a Roosevelt in New York City. His father moved to New Hyde Park, and his uncle moved to Long Island. And that's where the two chains broke. So Isaac Roosevelt is the first generation Hudson River, we'll say New Hyde Park Roosevelts. Excuse me. Roosevelt was a Federalist. Actually, he did attend the New York State Ratification Convention. He was an American founder. He wasn't just selling sugar and starting banks. He was an American founder. He served in the New York State Assembly, I believe it was. He did not make it to the Senate, but he did serve as on the Constitutional Ratification Convention. And he was a Federalist because he, like Hamilton, saw how much money rich people in New York could make if we became one nation. And he voted to ratify the Constitution at the New York Convention, which was one of many close conventions. And I will remind you that the Federalist Papers were written in New York for New Yorkers to convince a heavily anti-federalist New York to support this new government. But moving on, unless we have any questions, I am going to go dark for a second. Nope. Yeah, thank you. I see there's 4 of you. Someone hit like. If you guys want to hit like, that would be really helpful for me. Makes YouTube love me more and shares me more with other people, and then we grow this bigger community and talk about the revolution even more. So, we are going to... the next founder that I wrote about, the first new article I wrote this week, was about a man named Edward Preble, who was brought up last week. I believe it was Ned, you were the one who recommended I look into Edward Preble, and I did, and I wrote an article about him. So Edward Preble was he was a young man when the burning of Falmouth, Maine, which is now Portland, Maine, it was burned to the ground. And I had done a video maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago about that. And he was a boy and survived that horrific ordeal. And when he turned 18 years old, he joined the Massachusetts Navy. Which, it wasn't you, Ned? Someone said it. I wrote it down last week while we were talking. Well, I apologize for confusing. You have so many good recommendations, Ned, so I assumed it must have been you. It might have been, is it Edward Charles I? Your Majesty, there was what I assume was a pseudonym, which was King Charles I. He must have recommended it. But I did it. Edward Preble, he's at just 18 after surviving the burning of Falmouth. He joined the Massachusetts Navy. I will remind you that the Massachusetts Navy was different than the Continental Navy. That was different from the Virginia Navy and the South Carolina Navy. Every state had its own navy, and as did the Continental Navy. Edward Preble joined the Massachusetts Navy. He served for the duration of the war, after which he was a merchant on the high seas for a while, and then when 15 or so years later, when the quasi-war with France broke out, Edward Preble became a captain of a ship, and he joined the war. Quasi-war, I usually see it written in quotes, quasi-war with France, and he spent most of his time protecting merchant ships in the Caribbean, because most of that war was hijacking each other's ships in the Caribbean. Although he did travel to the Pacific at least one point, which I found interesting, because not a lot of intrigue between North America and Europe went all the way to that ocean. It did from time to time, even during the Revolution, actually. But I missed... while he was serving in the American Revolution, Preble was actually captured and spent time on the HMS, Her Majesty's ship, HMS Jersey. The Jersey, which was a prison ship in New York Harbor that had probably the most horrific conditions ever, definitely during the American Revolution, where people died of starvation, disease, wounds, a really terrible place to be. And he survived that, and like I said, would go on years later to join the Quasi-War, and at the end of the Quasi-War, he decided to resign. Oh, you're new to the Quasi-War, Ned. It's very interesting. President John Adams was president when it happened. He passed the Alien and Sedition Acts as a method to help fight that war, even though that was... historically, we look back on that as not the best move, because he limited freedom of speech, limited freedom of press. He actually had a member of the House of Representatives, Matthew Lyon, was arrested and put in jail for slandering the president, although he was re-elected to the House of Representatives while he was in jail for violating the Alien and Sedition Acts. I actually planned on doing a Matthew Lyon video this week, so I'm not going to get too into it now. But anyway, he did, they won the Quasi-War. Afterward, Preble decided to resign. Now, Benjamin Stoddard, who was Secretary of the Navy, tried to keep Preble around. He really liked Preble, he liked what he had to say. He liked how he captained his ships. And Preble said no, he was always fighting some disease, so he left. But he would not, Stoddard did not let him resign. Instead, he put him on indefinite leave, promising to give him another position when it was a great time when he was needed. So not long after that, Thomas Jefferson became president, and the First Barbary War breaks out. And Preble's needed again. So Preble is brought back, and he is named a Commodore, which is, if you're not familiar, and I don't know a lot about naval history, but he is the number one, it is the highest rank, to my understanding, you can achieve as a naval officer. Maybe Admiral? I should have probably looked into that. Now that I'm saying it out loud, all the TV shows, it's the Admiral in the White House. Anyway, he was put in charge of the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean is where the First Barbary War was being fought. So he went out and he first signed a treaty with Morocco pretty quickly, and then he oversaw the siege of Tripoli. Well, Tripoli was where most of the pirates were sitting during the First Barbary War, and his most notable battle was the Second Battle of Tripoli Harbor, where he attempted to raid the harbor on several occasions. Unfortunately, he was beaten back a number of times and lost a lot of good men, but he's most known for, Edward Preble is most known for what happened just beforehand, which was the burning of the Philadelphia. Philadelphia was a ship that ran aground while they were attacking Tripoli. Now, most of the men were able to evacuate the ship, but the people of Tripoli, their navy, their pirates, it's hard to call them navy, they took the ship and were using it to fire out at the Americans. So, Edward Preble oversaw it, although Stephen Decatur actually went in and led the attack. They actually conquered their own ship and then burned it to the ground so it couldn't be used. But this was done with the approval of Edward Preble. Decatur, a very interesting character in his own right. Now, not long after that, the following autumn, again, a long time sick, so Preble was always a little under the weather. He resigned, and he was replaced by Samuel Barron, who we spoke about, I believe, 2 weeks ago. Might have been last week, but I think 2 weeks ago, when I discussed several of the Barron family members. Preble comes back, and he oversees the building of ships for about 2 years, but then he passes away. Now, what's really important about Preble isn't necessarily his actions, but it was the way he operated. And when he first signed up, became a Commodore, he was very strict, kept a clean ship, kept his men, he would use discipline regularly, and this was uncommon at the time. Sailors, even in the Navy, kind of did what they want. They were in the high seas, the lawless marine world, and Preble made a very concerted effort to keep order as if it was a regular army on dry land. And this rubbed off on men who became known as the Preble's Boys. When Preble first took over, the oldest officer under his command was 30 years old. The youngest officer was 15. Quite literally, boys. And, some men, 30 years old, you're a man at that point, but young, they were young. So, his instillment of order on his ships was extremely influential on what I would refer to as the second generation of naval leaders. And I have a list of names here, and they might not all sound familiar, but Stephen Decatur, who we spoke about before, William Bainbridge, Charles Stewart, Isaac Hull, Thomas McDonough, James Lawrence, and David Porter. These might not be names that you know very well now, and they were never, Secretary of the Navy, but 10 years after Preble dies, the War of 1812 starts to rage, and these are the men who run the Navy. These become the highest ranking captains and commodores and admirals in the United States Navy. And they were all heavily influenced. They were all Preble's boys who learned how to run a ship from Preble. And that attitude of strict, I don't want to say strict, but the attitude he'd instilled in these young gentlemen is still really what prevails today in the Navy. Now, I've never been in the Navy, so I can't speak too intelligently on the matter, but, we follow orders. When you're in the Navy, you follow the orders of your commanders, just like the Army, and that is actually something that Preble instilled in the young American Navy. And it's fascinating. I didn't know a ton about Preble before I started researching last week when someone that's not Ned on this channel recommended I do so. And I'm really glad I did, because I learned a ton about him. And he was unbelievably important. I actually also realized that the town of Preble, which is about 25 minutes from here, is named after him. Probably irrelevant to you unless you live very close to me. Ned, ship for ship, was the American Navy at the time as good as the Brits or the French? No. No. So the British at the time were the most powerful navy in the world. And this is a time, I'm going to go back to white so I'm not too dark. The British during the American Revolution and just thereafter were the most powerful navy in the world. And there's no question about it. And no one really was close. Spain had been, but they had faltered over the previous 100 or so years. And France, I guess you could say, was comparable, but they were always comparable because they were trying to keep up with the British. America, no. I mean, in the American Revolution, most of our Navy wasn't even in the Navy. They were privateers, which the difference between a privateer and the Navy is the privateers were basically pirates, except they were given a piece of paper that said, a letter of marque was called, a piece of paper that said, here, you can be a pirate, but you only attack our enemy, and you can keep whatever or a large percentage of what you take from the ship. And so basically we were hiring pirates, or turning ship owners into pirates. Not necessarily what you need to make one big, powerful, strong navy, because they didn't have any orders to follow. They didn't have to follow orders, even if they were given to them. Now during the American Revolution, the privateers primarily did follow orders when they were given because they wanted to win the war, but it doesn't necessarily mean they had to. Thank you for asking that. I appreciate it. Always good. That's why I like to do these live videos. I don't know what I've left out writing these articles. That might be interesting. There are some things I know I left out, and we're going to get to a person that I know I left some things out. But let's move on. That's Edward Preble. Extraordinarily fascinating, I think. I wrote a strange article on Tuesday called "The Parallel Lives of Elisha Lawrence." Elijah. Elisha. Elisha. Either way. I noticed when I was researching a gentleman named Elisha Lawrence that there were two people named Elisha Lawrence, both from Monmouth County, New Jersey. Of course, it piqued my interest, so I dug a little deeper, and I wrote about these two gentlemen. They were from the same family. Most of this family did support the revolution, but some of them were loyalists. One Elisha Lawrence was a loyalist, one was a patriot, and they were cousins. And what I really found super interesting about this is how similar their lives were. So the loyalist was already a sheriff of Monmouth County when the Revolutionary War broke out, and he actually he joined the New Jersey Volunteers, which was essentially like a militia, but on the side of the British. Most of the militias joined the Patriots, but loyalists who wanted to fight in the militia created volunteer militias that were kind of parallel, but essentially part of the British, not resistance, onslaught team. They were Team Britain. So he became a lieutenant colonel in this militia. He did get captured by John Sullivan on Staten Island, and was paroled a few years later. And after the war ended, he went to Nova Scotia with many loyalists to leave the Americans, and he was elected to the Nova Scotia Assembly. The patriot, Elisha Lawrence, joined the militia as a major, but he also was a lieutenant colonel in the militia. So they were both lieutenant colonels in separate Monmouth County militias. And then, much like the patriot did very good in the Forage War. He actually became a quartermaster general. Not a quartermaster general. I'm sorry, let me say that again. A quartermaster. Quartermaster general runs all the quartermasters. He was just a quartermaster for his militia, for his regiment. But he did end up climbing through the local government. So he also went to the New Jersey Assembly. So they both became lieutenant colonels, and they both joined the local assembly. Now, the first one, the loyalist Elisha Lawrence, passed away not long after. He was older. Passed away not too long after in Nova Scotia. The younger one, our hero, so to speak, he made his way up through politics, eventually got into the New Jersey State Senate and became vice president of the New Jersey State Senate, which basically made him kind of lieutenant governor. They had a lieutenant governor, but it was weird. I didn't dig too far into it because New Jersey politics in the late 1780s, 1790s is not something I'm extraordinarily familiar with. And it was, as I was reading it, it was a little more convoluted than I was prepared for. And the reason is, in he was vice president of the state senate, and then when the president, Governor William Livingston passed away, Elisha Lawrence, who was vice president of the Senate, for some reason, was the one who became acting governor after you would think it would either be the lieutenant governor or the president of the Senate. No, neither of those people took over for the governor who passed away. Elisha Lawrence leapfrogged them and became acting governor. Now, it was just a few months, but he was technically the second governor of New Jersey. Imagine that. But that was, again, only a few months before William Patterson came along and was elected governor of New Jersey. So, that is Elisha Lawrence. A very obscure, like I said, he did become the second governor of New Jersey, which seems important, but it was just a few months, and nothing really happened while they waited for a new governor to be elected. Moving on, unless there's any questions, Dorothy Quincy, I wrote about on Wednesday, and as I've said before, it was worse when I was writing 7 days a week. Now I'm writing 5 new articles a week, so it bears me a little more time. But if I really research someone, I kind of have to get an article out. If I spend 2 hours researching her, kind of had to turn that into an article. And every once in a while, I write an article that I'll read the next day and be a little disappointed in. And Dorothy Quincy was an article I was a little disappointed in. And the reason is, I write about a lot of white guys. I'll be honest with you. And writing about some of the diverse founders of America is really nice and appealing to me, and I like to do it as much as I can. And Dorothy Quincy I thought was really interesting, but when I wrote her article, unfortunately, I did something that I always try not to do, and I think I've discussed it live before, is when I write about a female founder, a founding mother of the United States, I want to do my best to not make it about her husband. Now, that is what happened at the time, is women were attached to their husbands. So it's often difficult to diversify them from their husbands. Dorothy Quincy married a man named John Hancock, and her name became Dorothy Quincy Hancock. And he was sitting president of the Continental Congress when they got married. So, yeah, I unfortunately had to tie her to that because it's kind of a monumental moment. So John Hancock is 38 years old. He's the most eligible bachelor in Boston, if not British North America. He is extremely wealthy, and he was just president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which was essentially the shadow government running Massachusetts. So he was governor in all but name, and quite a catch. And Dorothy Quincy caught him, so to speak. Now, I didn't write a ton about John Hancock's aunt, Lydia. So John Hancock got super rich because he was adopted at a young age by his aunt and uncle, Lydia, and her husband, whose name escapes me. But he passed away, and John Hancock inherited his business. He still lived with his Aunt Lydia, and his Aunt Lydia is the one who wanted to hook him up with this Dorothy Quincy, because if the name Quincy sounds familiar, the Quincy's were an important family from Braintree, Massachusetts. She was a distant relative of the John and Abigail Adams. That's why their son, John Quincy Adams, has the middle name Quincy. So it was a good match. Now, she was taken out of the city just before Lexington and Concord, and actually Dorothy was with her fiance John and his friend Sam Adams when they were in Lexington, and Paul Revere showed up and said, "Hey, the British are coming." Didn't really say that, but the idea is there. And she was there and left there when John and Sam and Paul rode away to get away from the British. She was left there because women at the time were not as fearful of being taken hostage, especially because her family was not quite so outspoken about their patriotism. Some members were, I shouldn't say that was a big family, but her father was not that outspoken. His loyalties are questionable for everyone, so he was left alone. She actually did go back into Boston to see her father at one point before coming out, but she ends up going with John's Aunt Lydia to friends of the family in Connecticut. And I did read a story briefly about how a strapping young man named Aaron Burr came to visit at that house because he was from the area. And Lydia did all of her best to keep Dorothy away from this very charming Aaron Burr, which she successfully did. And I named the article Dorothy Quincy's Destination Wedding because on hiatus, later in 1775, at the end of 1775, Continental Congress took a hiatus, and John Hancock traveled to Connecticut. And they were actually married in Connecticut, even though they were both from Boston. So it was kind of a destination wedding. I thought that was clever, even though it might not be 100% true. Interestingly, and this is where I was able to kind of pull her away from her husband, but not, because Dorothy Quincy then goes, Dorothy Hancock goes to Philadelphia with John for the Second Continental Congress, and he's president, but he doesn't have a secretary, and she essentially acted as his secretary, which at the time, secretary was a man's job, because it was a job, and again, men did jobs, and women generally did not, especially upper class women. I mean, she's married to the wealthiest man in Massachusetts. She shouldn't have to work, but she does for the Patriot cause. She helps oversee his correspondence and help him keep some of his books, which I thought was fascinating and probably not spoken about enough. After that, she becomes First Lady of Massachusetts for the better part of 15 years when John Hancock becomes governor. And she sets, we'll call them precedents for how a First Lady of Massachusetts should act at that period of time. That's changed a lot nowadays, because now a First Lady, can get a job, because we live in the future. We made it. Now, there was tragedy in her life. Her first child was born and passed away within a year, a daughter named Lydia. And then they had a son named John George Washington Hancock. Great name. Unfortunately, when he was 8 years old, he was ice skating on a pond, and the ice broke, and he fell in and drowned. And then just a few years after that, John Hancock also passed away. So in the early 1790s, here we have Dorothy Hancock, who's now single, and she marries a man named James Scott. It was James, yes, James Scott. Now, this was a questionable marriage because he was technically below her station. James Scott was a friend of John Hancock and an employee. He was a captain of one of Hancock's most important merchant ships, which again, Hancock had all this money because he was a merchant. He would trade overseas, and one of the reasons we went to war was the dumping of the tea off of Hancock's ships. She marries James Scott. They actually moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the city I'm a big fan of. If you've been watching for a while, you would know. They moved to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they stay there for several years, probably 15 years or so. And then James Scott also passes away. So Dorothy Quincy Hancock Scott goes back to Boston and lives in Boston for another 20 or so years. As a widow. And her house has become somewhat famous. So that's the life of Dorothy Quincy Hancock Scott. If you had any questions, let me know. I do believe I saw a question pop up while I was talking. Generally speaking, what became of the Loyalists after the war? I assume they weren't thrown in prison or shunned. Did we just go about life as normal after the war? Okay, Ned, that's a great question, and I will sum it up as briefly as I can. During the war, most Loyalists left. I'm going to go back to my white screen so I'm not too dark. They either joined the British, and as soon as the war ended, they would have flocked to places like New York or other cities that had been occupied by the British, and they would evacuate and more or less go as refugees to places like Nova Scotia in Canada was one of the primary spots. There were a few islands in the Caribbean they went to stay British because that's what they wanted the whole time. Now, early in the actual war itself, the Patriots started having people sign loyalty oaths, and if you didn't sign that and you were a loyalist, you would have your property confiscated. So they'd already mostly had their property confiscated if they were a loyalist. It was never policy of the Continental Army or the Continental Congress to attack people or jail them, but it certainly happened locally, depending on where you lived and how friendly you were with your neighbors, whether or not you were jailed as a loyalist. Again, the more wealthy people were able to elude trouble, so to speak. Now, as far as... I should also say that after the war ended, they did try and get back to normal. And there were actually loyalists who came back to the United States. I'm trying to think of examples, names off the top of my head. I know recently we talked about Tench Tillman, for example, who was really a loyalist who stayed in Philadelphia. A lot of loyalists in Philadelphia just kind of stayed there and hung out, and after the war became founding fathers because they were there and wealthy and smart and could help. And they loved their country, even though it was a new country now. They wanted to help. No, they weren't just thrown in prison or shunned. During the war, they would have been shunned and possibly thrown in prison. But once the war was over, things pretty much... I mean, it's hard to say went back to normal because they were, starting a new country. But for loyalists, yeah, they generally would just kind of keep their head down and go back to things. But dozens and dozens of them, the wealthier ones, who were making, and even the middle class ones, we'll call them, who were making their way up in the world, would end up serving in local, this week I was smart enough to get some water. Excuse me. I've realized my throat's been drying out as I'm going, so I brought some water this time. Hi, TJ. Welcome. You can go back to the beginning if you want. You can hang out. We were talking about patriots, loyalists. Some loyalists did get elected to local governments and things of that nature. I lost my train of thought a little bit. TJ said, hi, I drank some water. I'm sorry, Ned, if I lost you a little bit. But to answer your question generally, things kind of did get back to normal. They weren't really shunned or imprisoned. They mostly evacuated if they could, or just joined the new nation. I will say, most loyalists who remain in the United States seem to have become Federalists. When, as the new government, when the Constitution was presented during the ratification process, most loyalists sided with the Federalist Party because they liked being part of Great Britain, the most powerful nation in the world. What's not to like? And was their attitude, and they wanted, if they were going to live in this new country, might as well make it as big and strong and powerful as we possibly can. That being said, great question though. Thank you so much. Anyone else? Okay, TJ, yeah, enjoy from the beginning. You can watch from here and then go back if you have any questions about our last two things. Two more. I wrote about Leonard Van Buren this week. So if Van Buren sounds familiar, I actually had written about... I actually wrote this article a few weeks ago and was kind of sitting on it, just sitting in my list of spares, so to speak, and I was like, let's do it, because it is very, very interesting. The name Van Buren sounds familiar. It's because we had a president named Martin Van Buren. Now, Martin Van Buren was the first American president to be born in the United States of America after it was called the United States of America. He was the first person born after the Declaration of Independence to become president of the United States of America. He was born in Fairleigh, upstate New York, and Kinderhook, which is it's pretty upstate actually. It's not far. It's not that far south of Albany. His family was of Dutch ancestry, as many in upstate New York were, and he had several members of his family help found the United States. They played a smaller role. His father, I read a little bit about, who was originally the person I was going to write about, but there isn't a ton of information. But I stumbled onto Leonard Van Buren, who was, if I'm not mistaken, a second cousin. It was a father's cousin. Is that a second cousin once removed, or the third cousin? I don't remember exactly how that works out. His dad's cousin, Leonard Van Buren. And he joined the Continental Army, and he became, he joined the Albany Militia, not the Army. He worked for New York State, even though, as I keep saying, they all kind of joined together and listened to what George Washington had to say. So, he was when the Continental Army was retreating from New York, Benedict Arnold famously, when he was still an American hero, assembled a navy on the shores of Lake Champlain. Essentially, he had his army and militiamen cut down trees and build a navy as the British were fortunately very slowly, coming down from Great Britain down towards the Hudson. And they were able to do this extremely quickly. It's an amazing feat. There is a book whose title, I believe, is Benedict Arnold's Navy. Actually, it's probably at the book. Yes. If you go to the link below, you can... there's a link on the page to Benedict Arnold's Navy by James Nelson, which is a great book that talks about this little navy Benedict Arnold built, which wasn't the Continental Navy, but it was essentially the first American Navy. And they just built it in a few months, right there. But I bring this up because Leonard Van Buren was there, and he was appointed to go by sailcloth and cordage, so they could make the sails for these ships that they were building. Now, Van Buren was not the first person to be sent. The first person was a man named William Bacon, who I did zero research on, so I'm not going to talk about him. All I know about William Bacon is he seems to have disappeared on everyone, because they sent him to get cordage and sailcloth and a few other supplies from Connecticut, and he basically disappeared. So then they send Leonard Van Buren, who goes down, who they call Captain Van Buren. He goes down to Connecticut. He meets with Governor Jonathan Trumbull. He gives Jonathan Trumbull a letter for William Bacon that says, "Hey, William Bacon, if you ever turn up, don't buy anything. We're not going to refund you your money because you bailed on us." And then Van Buren works with Trumbull to collect the necessary supplies, and he goes up and gives them back to Arnold and helps, in his own little way, build this first American Navy. So after that, he goes to, now I'll get to that later. He goes to New York, and he actually collects intelligence for the British. Now, I couldn't find a ton of primary resources talking about the work he did, but there was a report to Major General Horatio Gates that discussed troop numbers, the health of their men, and the morale of their men, which I found interesting. He didn't talk too much about movements or plans. He talked about how many people there were and how they were feeling. It's always interesting when you read about people's intelligence, because some people are more focused on the numbers and the movements in the war, and he's focused on, are they excited for this? How excited are they going to be? Now, one of the things he did alert Gates, who then told Washington about, he told them about a rumor going around that the British were considering moving north on the Hudson for a second time. They were talking about going north on the Hudson and taking the Hudson River in an attempt to cut the colonies in half. Because the Hudson River was not right in the middle of the colonies, but essentially you could separate New England from the rest of the colonies, take over New England fairly easily, and then just close in on both sides from the south and from the Hudson. At some point, Van Buren was taken as a hostage. Let's say prisoner of war. Hostage is technically the wrong term. He was taken as a prisoner of war stayed there for several months, and there was a young woman named Elizabeth Bergen who helped him get out of prison. And again, there's not a lot of primary resources, but reading through the letters, we learn he writes to Bergen when he escapes, and then she's released on parole. And he writes to her because he finds this out, and she goes to Philadelphia. And he's upset that she doesn't come to New York to stay with him. Now, I don't know if it's a romantic reason or anything like that, but he certainly did not seem happy that this young lady was going to Philadelphia. But what he did is he sent her $500, which was a lot of money back then. He sent her a letter to give to one of his friends in Philadelphia that if she needed to purchase something, she could do so on his credit. And this person knew him and would take his credit from her if Miss Bergen had Van Buren's letter, which would have been extremely helpful for essentially a refugee. And he also wrote her a letter, a certificate that talked about how trustworthy she was, which didn't in itself do anything, but moving to a new city of Philadelphia, having a captain, how do I say, a captain's recommendation, it couldn't hurt. So that's essentially everything you could possibly know about Leonard Van Buren. What I stumbled on before and said I'd get back to is there are, in the first 6-8 months of doing Founder of the Day, writing these articles, I covered most of the bigger founders, and I'll still go back to them and write little stories about their lives, but now I get really curious about these really super obscure people. You know, the Leonard Van Burens or the Elisha Lawrences of the world. Very few people ever hear about. So when I write about like this article, it bounces around a little bit, but I essentially cover the entirety of his life. Like all of the information, all of the letters you're going to find, you know. I do most of my research on the internet, which I know sounds wrong, but you know I use things like Founders Online, which if you're not familiar, Google Founders Online. It is the best thing the National Archives have ever done. It's a page on the National Archives where you can search almost 200,000 letters and correspondence and documents that are primary resources from the Revolution. It's an unbelievable thing, and I probably would not be able to do it without. I probably wouldn't be able to do what I do without it, because I wouldn't have the primary resources. Although, I do search Google Books. You can read through lots of books written either at the time or in the 1800s or early 1900s. There's really a ton, and those are all really well resourced and things like that. So I've gone through everything about Leonard Van Buren you could possibly find, and really got into his life. So I don't want to get too into that. But if you were wondering, that's a little insight into how I do my research and why someone like Leonard Van Buren, who is, I'm assuming, someone you've never heard of, how I have so much information on him. But finishing up here, how far are we? How long have we been going? Does it tell me? Does it tell me how long we're... Oh, 48 minutes. Ooh, might... See if we keep it under an hour again. This might be the first time we go over an hour. Thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. There's been 4 or 5 of you watching pretty much the whole time. It's super cool for me. I really appreciate it. I hope you're enjoying yourselves. Yeah, TJ. Those are the Founders Online is the best resource you're gonna find for the American Revolution if you want to read primary resources. Because not only is it the letters themselves, but there are editors on there who put footnotes down there to help like connect some dots. They'll say, hey, you can go to this letter or this letter for more on this topic. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. It's the best thing that the United States government has ever done, is published its own history. Maybe that's not true. Clearly I'm biased. Alright, to finish up here, I wrote about Federalist 74 yesterday, which yesterday was March 27th, 2020, which was my 36th birthday. Happy birthday to me, thanks. But I bring it up because Federalist 74 was written on March 25th, 1788. So that's what? Almost to the day, 232 years and 2 days. It's probably as close to as the exact date as we're going to get, because I've been writing Federalist Papers once a week for the last year and a half. I'm at 74. I think there's 85. I'll be done in June after a year and a half of one a week, which just indicates how many they wrote in 8 months. It's from, I believe it started in November of 87 and really in August, but really in June. They finish up. So in like an 8-month period, thanks TJ, in like an 8-month period, they wrote 86 of these papers that have taken me, again, one a week for a year and a half. Let's see. So Hamilton covers two things in Federalist 74. He covers the president's place as the commander-in-chief of all troops in the United States, and it covers the president's power to veto. So the first thing you notice about this Federalist paper is how short it is. It's like 4, maybe 5 paragraphs, but some of them have like 1 or 2 sentences. It's way shorter than most of what he writes. So that indicates immediately that there was not a lot of resistance to these ideas, or at least Hamilton didn't care to talk too much about them. And what he gets out of the way right away is the discussion as the president's place as commander-in-chief of all the troops. And he specifically says both the federal troops and the militias, which I would have assumed there'd be a lot of anti-federalist pushback against the militias. Like, these are the state-run. Why would the president have the authority to run the states? Now, to be fair, he did cover this in some of the earlier Federalist papers, but he was writing then why the federal government should have control over the militias in time of emergency. In this, he's really just saying the president is the only person to run all of the troop, run the whole show, essentially. And as he mentions, as opposed to like a board or something like that, or separate generals in separate areas. And it seems to me that the reason he doesn't go too deep into this is because there wouldn't have been a ton of argument against it. You would have learned, any amateur historian of military history at the time would know that if you have more than one leader of an army, that army is going to fall apart. The leaders are going to disagree, and even if they don't attack each other, they're going to leave themselves open to be defeated. And that's probably why Hamilton doesn't spend a lot of time on it, because, no, to win a war, you need one commander-in-chief. Excuse me. Sorry. I get a little dry. I'm talking for an hour here. I brought a water this time. You'll forgive me, I assume. So, not a lot of resistance to why one president should be commander-in-chief. They all just kind of run with it. No big deal. There was a lot more resistance to the president's right to pardon people. And the main argument against this was the King of England could just pardon whoever he wanted, and that didn't go very well now, did it? And again, they said, why don't we have, like, a board? Why doesn't the Senate or the House of Representatives decide on pardons? Or do we have a separate board that's appointed that is only there for pardons? Hamilton's argument is, sometimes, for national harmony, we might need the president to pardon people real quick. What's interesting, and again, this is the shortest paper. This might be the shortest Federalist paper. I don't necessarily remember the length of all of them over a course of a year and a half, but I guarantee it's, if not the shortest, it's top 3 shortest. It's not long at all. Hamilton's argument essentially was the president might have to pardon people swiftly. He might have to quickly pardon people, and with a board or more than one person making that decision, it's just not going to happen. Now, if the president starts using pardons to bail out his friends and committing crimes, you always have impeachment. If he's really misusing it, then you have impeachment, and we can, you have censure, you have impeachment. There are various parliamentary tools that we've incorporated in this Constitution that let the Congress check and balance the president and the Supreme Court check and balance the president. This is not something that urgent. What's really interesting is Hamilton was quickly proven right. The Whiskey Rebellion broke out just 2 or 3 years, 4 years, or maybe 5 years. Was it 1794? I don't remember exactly how many years, shortly after Washington becomes president, within his first term, the Whiskey Rebellion breaks out in western Pennsylvania because they're taxing whiskey. Because Hamilton had a plan for the Treasury Department, blah, blah, blah. Whiskey Rebellion breaks out. It is quickly quenched, or quelched, or suppressed. It is quickly put to rest. And the president, all the leaders are convicted of crimes of treason because they revolted against the national government. And President Washington quickly offers pardons for them to get everything back to normal. It was probably the right thing to do. But if there were more than one person making this decision, well, there might be some politics involved. Some people might want to do it. Some people might not want to pardon them. And it could have caused trouble. But the president acted quickly. Similar thing happens after the Civil War. There were a lot of pardons right after the Civil War to try and get the South integrated back in. And even the best example that occurred to me immediately upon reading this was after President Nixon resigned, President Ford pardons him almost immediately. Why? To get things back to normal. And that's essentially, of all the things Hamilton's written, this shortest Federalist paper is the one that's just historically been proven right again and again. Time and time again. So that's it. Those are my articles for the week. Thank you so much for watching. The 5 of you who have been here. Last week we had 4. The week before we had 3. So next week hopefully we have 6. Maybe 7 or 8. So the more we keep going, the more people will join us. And I really appreciate all of you who have joined me. Oh, did you call me an old guy, TJ? How dare. How dare. I was old when I was 19. Ask any of my friends and family. I was the one sitting around reading history books when I was 19 years old. Yeah, thank you, Ned. Thank you, TJ. Thank you, everyone, for joining. The 3 of you who haven't commented at all, I still appreciate you being here tremendously. If you would do me a favor and hit like before you go, I would truly appreciate that. If you do want to support the site, I still have the Streamlab. I got to drop the cash to get rid of that. Trying to raise $300. If you guys wanted to support me on Patreon, I would really appreciate that. There's lots going on over there. If you wanted to go to my shop and buy a t-shirt or a cool coffee mug. I have a bunch of founder quotes on there. Check that out. I'm not here to sell myself, but I am, every little bit counts. Thank you so much for watching. If there's any last questions, send them in. I think we covered everything. I am gonna go. I'm still coming up with an ending, a sign off. I think for my regular videos, I'm gonna start saying I'll be back with another founder for you tomorrow. I've been saying video. Don't know why it took me so long to come up with founder. But for the live videos, I guess I'll just say see you later, founder fans, and thank you for watching.